it turns out there's one really subtle bug in our ArraySet class. In particular, if we were to add null and then add some more stuff to our set, we get a null pointer exception. Now what's maybe a little stranger is that it actually happens when we add the word horse, not when we add null. And the null pointer exception happens on this line of ArraySet. So to see what's going on, I'm going to set a breakpoint. Okay, so let's run our code real quick. So we're going to add null to our ArraySet. So right now this is our ArraySet. We run that line of code. Size is 1. This is still null because we added null. And then when we try and add horse, the first thing we do is we call contains. We do contains, we step in, and this is the line that's going to break. In particular, at this point, what the code reads is, if items I equals x, so that's items 0 equals x, then return true. But the problem is that when Java tries to follow this pointer to go get its equals method, right, items 0, there's no object to point at. And so here we get a null pointer exception because there's no object that we're pointing at to call equals on. So we run the next line of code, and then that's when we get our null pointer exception. So this type of exception that we're seeing here is what is known as an implicit exception, or accidental exception, or incidental exception, whatever you want to call it. It's an exception that just happens because something broke. Okay. Now exceptions, as you know, they cause the normal flow of control to stop. And what I mean by that is that we don't finish running these other lines of code. In this case, what happens is the code just crashes, stops running. Now, alternately, one can actually throw your own exceptions. And let's see what that would look like in this case. So I would argue it's a little strange for the exception to be happening when we add horse. So instead what we could do is we could basically make the program error out if someone tries to add null. So to do that, what we can do is go into the add method, and we can say if x equals null, and then I'm going to basically make the code crash. Now how do I make the code crash? Well, there is a way to make your own exceptions. And if you've seen Python before, you've seen the raise keyword. So in Java, it's throw. And being a very object-oriented language, we have to throw actual objects. So I need to instantiate something. And what I'm going to instantiate is an illegal argument exception, which is an object that can be thrown. And I might say something like, you can't add null to an ArraySet. And so by adding this message, if we now run our code again, we see you can't add null to an ArraySet. So this is arguably a better way of doing things, because now there's a more useful message and things are crashing in the right place. Now, maybe you don't actually want your program to crash because it'd be a little annoying if you're playing, I don't know, you're using the, let's say, Facebook app, and it's written using Java, let's say, and if it runs into an error like this, it's annoying if it just errors on you and you just see this can't add null to an ArraySet when you're just trying to like share a picture of a dog. And so in real programs, often what will happen is when exceptions are thrown, there's other code that can catch that exception and respond to it in some smart way. Now I'm not going to talk about catching, but if you've seen this in other languages, this would be something where you say like try catch, but that's not happening in this lecture. We'll talk about that more towards the end of the course, but I just want to mention that just because you're throwing an exception doesn't mean your program necessarily crashes. There's ways to catch exceptions, but for now, that's what we're going to do. We're just going to make the exception cause the program to crash. Now, arguably, you shouldn't be throwing an exception at all because it's annoying for this exception to occur at this point. Like maybe you should make your code actually robust against nulls being put into it instead of throwing up your hands and saying, I don't know what to do about this. So for example, we could say if x equals null, we just return and ignore the add. And then in our specification for the ArraySet class, we'd have to say something like ignores nulls that user tries to add. Okay? That's something you could do. Another approach you could do is change the contains method so that it doesn't crash if one of the items is null. So in particular, what we could do is write code that is so-called null safe. So we could do something like if x equals null, then if, or actually let's do this. If items I equals null, then if x equals null, return true, and you might do something like that. And that's probably a little more popular than throwing an exception if someone tries to add a null, because that's another approach we could do. And actually, if you go looking at real code, you'll see this kind of null safe code all over the place. So for example, this is part of the JUnit library, the actual JUnit you've used in this class. And we can see that it has this funny method that tries to compare two objects, but takes into account the possibility that one or both of them is null. And so it ends up being a little more complicated. Nulls could be kind of a pain in the butt. All right. So whatever you decide to do, you can, but what I've decided to do, at least just in this lecture, is we will have, if x is null, we're going to throw that runtime exception. So that was the approach I took, but there's other possibilities. Can't add null. One last note I should make is that the actual Java set implementation, you might be curious what it does. So if we create a hash set, and we call this s2, and we add null, and then we say s2.contains null. Okay, so if we run this, we'll see that Java, it just treats null like any other string, and so arguably, oops, well, we can't do that. Sorry, I got to take that away. So if we run this, we get true. So a set of strings can contain a null in Java. So that's the approach they took. But in our array set, I've chosen a different tack, which is that we throw an exception if you add null. Now, both approaches are valid strategies. The only important thing is making sure the user knows what to expect, which is why documentation like this is so important.